Hi everybody, welcome to this enhanced edition of the Stellium Astrology podcast. I'm Stephanie James, your host, and you may already be familiar with my guest today as I constantly name drop him. But you may have already heard of him outside of the podcast because he's actually a very well-known astrologer, Frank Clifford, who is the principal of the London School of Astrology, which is my spiritual home. It's basically what I call it. And, it was the place where I really initiated my astrological education, and I had some of the most amazing learning experiences of my life with some of the most amazing people, not just the teachers, the students too. It was a really great place to be, and Frank made that possible for me. So how are you, Frank?
I'm good, thank you, Stephanie. Hi there. And I actually remember where I was the first time you rang. Isn't that strange?
I remember where I was the first time I rang you.
Isn't it
How
odd?
weird? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember thinking your name was James at the end and you corrected me, and it's just funny how these things stay in your memory, but that was quite some time ago.
And that was the personal touch as well, because before I actually decided to sign up to the school, I thought I really need to speak to somebody just to find out what it's all about and whether it's really for me. And I rang up and spoke to you, and you were very friendly and very warm, and you basically said there's no pressure, come for a term, see what you think. I think I'd missed the free class at that point, because you do a sort of like an introductory free class every year, don't you?
Right, yes.
I think I'd missed that, but I managed to make it in time for the first term. And the thing is, when you're on the phone, you actually sound a lot older than you are, I think.
I've been told that for years, yes.
Yeah. And when I turned up to my class, I was looking for this guy, and then I realised that you were standing at the front. I was like, oh my gosh, so much younger than he sounds. But it was just a funny thing, because I do really clearly remember that phone call and exactly where I was standing and everything. So, but I feel like it was kind of a fated moment for me, because I had Jupiter was sort of like hanging around in my 12th house, but coming around, getting ready to go into my first. So I was having this amazing Jupiter transit. And my first class at the LSA, I had some incredible transits that day as well. I think I was having Jupiter creeping up on my first house, and I had Mars on my Jupiter. I had something was on my midheaven. I was having my Saturn return. What was on my midheaven? I can't remember now. I had all these really amazing transits for my first ever class in the LSA, and it was the first time I came home from any kind of class and was so thoroughly engaged. I couldn't wait to get on with studying extra, things that you'd suggested. And it was the first time ever that I really think that I felt engaged in a subject.
Wonderful, wonderful. Kim and I always do that first class together, Kim Farley and I, and always have some fun doing that. And this year we did it, of course, in person. There was a space in October when we were allowed to be in person.
Wow,
and
that's lucky.
We also had it. I know we just only lasted about a week, and then we had to go back online. But we had people online watching, and we had people in at the meeting room. So, yeah, it's been most students have important transits when they start astrology, and I sort of play that down a bit because I don't want them thinking like I'm blackmailing them into 3 or 4 years of study. But so often they'll say, "Well, nothing happened to me then," and it was a life. It's supposedly a life-changing transit, and then you say, well, 2 years ago was when you started astrology, and then they start to realize how important it was. It wasn't simply just going to a class or clicking online and connecting. It was really the beginning of a in-depth connection and an in-depth period of self-discovery.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly what it felt like for me. And I think for a number of people that were in the class with me, some of the people that I met in that class, I'm still really good friends with, and have gone on to really pursue their subject of passion that they learned at the London School of Astrology, which a few of us actually we call it Hogwarts, because it's kind of what it's a bit like. Because I didn't just study astrology there, I studied a bit of palmistry with you. I did a couple of intro palmistry courses, and I also did tarot as well. Which I did with Sue Fairbrother, but you also have tarot classes with Mario now as well, don't you?
That's right. We're not doing any in person this year. We're doing them online for the coming year. It's just that right now people don't know what they want to do yet, and I totally understand that. Some people, even if we're allowed to by September, all meet up and congregate and be next to each other, a lot of people are still quite fearful. So we're just online for now, and that suits me. It saves me from traveling in the freezing cold and in the winter months,
and lugging all those things that you used to lug with you as well.
Yes, I did. And then they were kind enough to hold them for me, but I still lug in a load of books and a lot of different giveaways that we hand out. So, yeah.
So you kind of, where did you start? Was it astrology or palmistry that was your kind of initial subject?
Astrology, I was fascinated. I picked up books. It was when you could go into W.H. Smith and they would have a range of interesting astrology books rather than just year aheads. They had those as well, but it was back in the late 1980s. Gosh, and I think I probably got interested in astrology about maybe 12, 13, but I went to an astrologer at 16, and that I came home and I started teaching myself that afternoon. So it was just a fascinating beginning. And I never had a teacher, really. Obviously, you learn from everybody you read, everybody you meet. I never had a particular school or group that I was involved in. And that was useful in some ways, because they can get a bit cliquey sometimes. And I didn't want to just learn one way. I didn't want to learn somebody's way. I wanted to gather as much as I could by studying charts, studying biographies, learning astrology in action. Really, that was the key.
I definitely needed somebody to help me to pull it together in a structured way. Yeah. I knew I had books. I'd already been sort of following the moon stuff, all the lunar stuff, and I did have books and people had bought me gifts and stuff. But for me, I just needed somebody. I don't know why. I think that's just my style, just having somebody there to guide me through. And I think that it's such a huge subject. So many people I speak to, some people find their own way and they do it, either using websites these days rather than books, but, find their own way of learning the subject. But I'm thinking more of things like astro.com or like SkyScript, those kind of things, right, which are incredibly useful and really, really good. But yeah, for myself, I just didn't have that kind of knowledge of where to start. There was just so much information. I just needed somebody to sort of say, this is where you need to look first, and sort of go from there. So I found the learning at school type environment, and especially the classroom environment, for me, I really found it useful. And I know it's different when you've got an online thing. I've done online classes as well, but I really enjoyed the interaction in person.
Yeah.
I think that astrology, you need that, don't you? That conversation.
You do. And one of the things we tried to do in the last year during lockdown is to have breakout rooms. So groups of 3 or 4 people that have met each other, know each other in person, can get to chat to each other and feel like they're back, at least in a semi-classroom environment. But yeah. I would have probably learned astrology faster had I gone to a proper school. I think I was 16 years old and I was shy and hesitant, really. And I guess, this was before the internet, so you're not really you're not aware of what's around, what exists. So it was easier to sit there and teach myself.
Yeah. And what about palmistry? Because you've told me a bit of a horror story that you had with your palmistry, actually.
Yes, I did. Yes. My dad went to see a palmist, and it was very unusual. He came home one day and said he'd had a palm reading, and the rest of the family were really, really shocked. And it must have been probably around that time when I was about 15 or 16. And yes, it was very unusual for my dad. My dad was emotionally driven, but he was also very practical in the sense that, and I think he was very curious, and that got me very interested. I think I was already teaching myself astrology or around that time. And we all went to see the palmist. And then I went to see another palmist who sort of implied that I would be married at 21 and my partner would die. And that stayed with me. And I thought, this is scary stuff. You need to be really careful. And of course, that didn't happen. But it did made me very anxious for a while, and it made me want to learn the subject and do it better. That's really what it did. So when I understood what she was looking at, I understood that it wasn't a sort of, predestined sort of thing. And I understood that it didn't need to be said like that, and it didn't need to be said. So in fact, she inspired me. I actually went back and learned some palmistry from her, the second palmist.
Wow,
in fact,
really?
I learned from both of them, but I went back and I thought, I need to learn what you're doing, and also not to do it well and not to scare people. And you do learn, what this is like when you see clients. You have to be super careful what you say, and you make mistakes along the way, and you say too much, or you imply, or the ego gets involved and you want to make a prediction instead of empower the person to make positive choices for themselves. There are all sorts of pitfalls, not just learning the subject, but then communicating it to somebody else. And that can be one of the big lessons that you learn in the early days, and you keep learning. It's always, clients are always delightful and challenging at the same time, because you're being recorded. It's important what you say. It's important how you say it. So there's a lot of responsibility there. Yeah.
It's a much bigger responsibility than I think I ever initially realized. And you hear through conversations with other people. I mentioned on another episode that I've recorded, I've recorded a few episodes on kind of ethical practice, actually, because as you are aware, I had an issue when I went to a conference in India, a few issues really, that really shaped the way that I wanted to handle my interactions with other people, with my clients particularly, and didn't want to leave people feeling any sense of a lack of control over their lives is one of those things. Not that we can really control anything, but the fact that they can have a choice in what they want. And also sort of to scare people unnecessarily, or use the reading to drive either an agenda that you're aware of, or a completely subconscious agenda that you're out of touch with because you haven't done the self-work. So I think that from my experience, the people that I've spoken to who have ultimately been the best teachers for me are the ones who really have had a similar kind of experience in their life that have made them address those questions of ethics themselves. That with your palmistry reading, your palm reading, that was so condemning and so scary, to think that that you would meet somebody and you'd finally find that person, and then that's it, you'd lose them as well. And it would be almost like a feeling of, I don't want to meet anyone because that means I'm gonna fulfill this prophecy. It's amazing, because words really do carry power, and whether or not they're true, what you can do to somebody using words can really affect huge outcomes in their life without even realizing. Something so flippant in passing, you could say, that could ultimately change somebody's direction completely. So
yes. And I'm extra careful these days, particularly if I'm aware that there are some people you're aware that they're extra sensitive to information, and it might be what you're saying and how they're interpreting it, but often I'll spend a bit of time during the session or at the end of it, or even invite them to email me later when they listen to the recording again, to invite questions if they've misunderstood something, or they've been left feeling anxious about something. Because we all know, we've all had that experience where you say something and it's not what you've said, but they've taken it in a particular way, or you've left something out and it's what they wanted to hear. So they've thought, because you've left it out, there's a negative association with it.
Yeah.
He didn't tell me I was going to get married or have children. He didn't mention children, so it must mean I'm not going to have them. That type of thing. And you have to be so careful, because you're in a powerful position. All you are really is an astrologer or palmist, is a translator. You're doing your very best to translate what you see in front of you, what you've learned, what you've observed over the years, the stories the people the clients you've had. And as a translator, the gift has to be in the language of how you say it. And people are stressed. Life is tough, and a lot of people are damaged. And we could do a whole podcast just on mental health at the moment and in general. And we need to be super, super careful what we say to people, because our words carry weight. And the issue is, and as you say, what you found in India, the issue is often wrapped up in ego, wanting to be the guru, or it's a bit that thing about somebody telling you that they're a guru or they're spiritual. If you have to say it, it doesn't really ring true. When somebody announces I'm on a spiritual path, I always think, yeah, but maybe do the laundry first. I think there was a book with that title, sort of, now the laundry. So there's always a mix of both, and I'm a bit suspicious of anybody who sets themselves up as somebody who knows everything, or some sort of guru with power, because it's ego, and it's usually, if we think about the astrology of it, it's often very second house, eighth house. It's often about a particular value system. It's often particularly about desire or sex or some sort of gender power play going on, and it could even be fifth house. It's very interesting how that comes up and how dangerous it is in the wrong hands.
Well, the good thing is that before I decided to embark on learning counselling skills separate from astrology, there was a huge emphasis on how to work in a positive way with the client at the LSA. That's a large focus. I really feel that that's a large focus of what you teach, because we didn't just look at the chart. It's a bit like when you go on these Facebook forums. I was on one the other day, and somebody had Chiron and Jupiter in Cancer in their 7th house. And he said, am I ever going to meet someone? I feel like I'm destined to be alone forever. And there were loads of really encouraging comments. But then there was just one guy that said, no, your love life's going to be painful and you're destined to be alone. And I thought, what on earth kind of advice is that? But, every now and again, we'd be in a class and somebody would jump to a very very basic interpretation, which is almost very 1D version of what the symbolism of the placement could be. And it would always be very interesting to actually say, well, no, actually, this doesn't necessarily mean that. There are many different meanings to this, and it's so difficult. It's trying to expand somebody's vocabulary as an interpreter to understand that it's not necessarily going to be the most basic interpretation, which may not be true for that person. It's about actually really starting to sort of go deeper and actually pull out some of the really, really buried layers of meaning, which actually paint a much deeper picture, a much truer picture of that placement. So what I thought the fun things we did were when you would invite a guest to come in, we'd look at the chart first, and then we'd invite the guest to come in and speak, and we'd guess what they did for their profession. And, so it would be very easy to pick out things that you could immediately project negative traits onto. But then that person would be sitting in front of us and we'd hear their story. And you'd immediately hear that those negative traits, negative, I say, very loosely here, would be just part of that person's story. And it would play out in a very different way to the way that you might have intended to say it.
Yes, and you realize that you can say things in class about a chart, and then there are things you would never say to somebody face to face. It's a bit like being on Twitter or somewhere, where people say the most horrendous thing to each other, but you'd never really say that in person. But I remember a few years after you were in class, we were doing transits, and a student turned to another student, and this second student had the sun in Capricorn in the 8th house. And Pluto was about, like you, and Pluto was crossing over, and the other student said to this student, oh, your dad will probably die. And it was a moment, it took a while to undo that. And in fact, I ended up being, we ended up being almost kicked out of the building eventually, just the two of us, because I was standing there talking to her about how that person had done the algebra, but came to some conclusion, or did some addition and subtraction, and came to some conclusion that really didn't have to match anything. And she was very, very anxious about that. And she rang, oddly enough, the other day, and we spoke about that transit. And her father hadn't died, but it was a major personal transformation of who she was in life. She was going deeper. She was doing more psychological courses, and it was a enormous time of growth. And had she just stayed with that prediction from somebody who was just putting the pieces together incorrectly, it would have upset her. But the issue as well, of course, is that when you read something about your natal chart or a transit, it attaches itself to a fear you already have, usually like Mercury retrograde, and the book says you're not very bright. I mean, who would ever read that or want to write that sort of thing? It's ridiculous. Donna Van Toen wrote, she died a few years ago. She wrote a book on the nodes, the node book, I think it was called, or something like that. And one of she had a list of options for each of the nodal combinations and things to do. And I've got the North Node in Capricorn, and her advice was to commit suicide.
What?
I know, and it's in the book. And so when she died a few years ago on Facebook, a couple of people were saying it was a fabulous book. And I just wrote very dryly, I said, as soon as I read her advice for Capricorn North Node to commit suicide, along with other things, it was just there. It was like, run a business, do this, commit suicide. And I just said, I just put it back on the shelf, and I haven't picked it up since.
I can't believe you would say that.
I can't believe you would write it, because that's got even more power for X number of people who are going to come across that at some point. So I don't know what we're doing sometimes as astrologers, what we're writing, what we're putting out there. It's certainly not humane at times. It certainly doesn't keep the door open for empowerment, for choice, for the idea that my transit isn't powerful enough to kill my dad, like that student. Her Pluto transit isn't powerful enough to finish him off, nor should it necessarily reflect that. But the problem is, people do put those two together, and they look at their transits in the last period of their life, and they look at difficult times, and they see, oh, my mother passed away, and that was happening in my chart. They don't realize that the event is not what the chart was talking about. It was talking about connecting to the process. So you might think, oh, Neptune was square my moon and my mother died, or I ended up being in a relationship with an alcoholic. And you think, oh, that's simply it. This plus this equals that event. And it never really works like that. It's so much more about, this is a season of your life to get to know Neptune, to understand it, to make healthy choices about that part of your chart, that part of your life. And when people get out of that way of thinking that this transit equals this event, they're a lot more powerful, they're a lot freer. I'm doing this in China at the moment for the school there, and I still get, well, I've got this happening to me, so is it going to be a bad time? And I have to sort of keep tearing that up and saying, what do you want to do about it? You know, shit happens. Crap happens all the time. People do die. People leave. People make terrible decisions. People have all sorts of tragedies. The world can be in a terrible mess. That's not what's being predicted for you in the chart. And I think it's super important for people to recognize that. But the association is too simplified. A bit like you read your sun sign, your star sign in the paper, and it's supposed to tell you what sort of day you're going to have, or what sort of simple personality you're going to have. And we know it's much more complicated, much more complex.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of was thinking about what it's like to be under the, having a transit like a Neptune transit or a Pluto transit or anything. You operate under the influence. It's not necessarily that it's dictating that you are going to have a certain set of events occur, but especially with the slower planets that take longer, it's a sense of you almost, I think you described it as planetary transits, almost they permeate everything, and it becomes present in everything that you're involved with. It's like being under the influence, driving under the influence. You know, there's a certain type of influence each planet would have on you, and you make choices based on the influence that you're experiencing at the time. Not necessarily that it's going to force, like I've had a Pluto transit to my sun. It's been and gone now. It's still hanging around, kind of close, but it's not that close anymore. My dad retired from his job, and he had like a very, very strong work ethic his entire life. And I think after I had a Saturn to my Pluto, which was around the time I joined the LSA, and my mum had a near-death experience, and it kind of forced everybody in my house who had very strong work ethic, very old school attitude towards, what's possible as far as career is concerned, and that kind of like they felt that if they weren't at work, the place would fall down without them kind of attitude, and they had to be there every day, come rain or shine. It taught my mum about self-care, and my dad in turn learned about self-care because he realized that we are ultimately only here for a very short period of time, and we have to enjoy what time we do have on this planet. So for my Pluto transit, externally viewing through my parents, yes, they went through their own transformations, particularly my dad going through his retirement, and I went through all sorts of interesting and fun things. I've never felt so alive. So just anybody who's got Pluto creeping on their sun in Capricorn and is thinking, oh my goodness, what does that even mean? But just FYI, I had a good experience, and some bad experiences rolled in, but ultimately I'm still here and I'm still smiling. So, it's not necessarily going to be a terribly negative thing.
No, and it is, you can think of it as being under the influence, or you could think of it as having a particular lens that you see the world through during that time. And a lot of people just choose to close their eyes and to walk through blindly, and not to realize that this is a season for Pluto. This is a season for a metamorphosis, a change, some sort of growth and development, the killing off of an aspect of your life, and then a new development beyond that. So people, it is a lens. And what often happens is that people who refuse to see that, refuse to keep their eyes open, it's still that season. You're just going to be less in control of it. You're going to be less aware of engaging or actively participating in it. And Liz Green would always say, if you don't do something internally about it, it will appear from outside as fate. Something happens that feels very Plutonic to you, instead of the journey being about your own personal development. And I really see that all the time. People that are absolutely fearful of it, refusing to engage in the process of whatever is being asked of them. And it's a personal transit to your chart. We know the Saturn-Pluto of 2020, the Jupiter-Saturn of 2020. These are all collective things. We can see it in the news, we can see it all around us. But when it becomes personal, it's about our personal growth. It's not necessarily directly linked to anything that happens to us from the outside.
And it's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction 2020 was just such a huge thing for humanity. Astrologers were talking about this for years before it happened, weren't they? It's just such an enormous thing.
Yes, I don't think they understood. I certainly, some of them, people, it was the French astrologer André Barbeau was talking about pandemics with all the planets on one side of the zodiac. He felt that was often a time when things tipped over, literally, the scales tipped. But I didn't think it. I just thought, let's get organized. And I mean, I was in China at the time, and I came home sick, and I was in Australia for a couple of weeks after, and I was sick while I was there, and I didn't have the symptoms. I just had a heavy flu, but it was the beginning of the beginning, really, the beginning of the end of all of that. But it's interesting. We astrologers have an opportunity to interpret that, but you see, what the government did or didn't do with that, or what they're continuing to do, are their choices. And it's so all we can do, we can obviously protest if we need to protest, we can make our voice heard, we can vote, we can do all sorts of things. But on a personal level, Saturn-Pluto is going to be about killing off old responsibilities, bringing new ones in. So there's always a way we can look forward. We can look at it and think, what's being asked of us here. Even if the world appears to be in a mess and the governments aren't doing enough and we're back in lockdown, whatever, we can, it's always bringing us back to the center of what we can be doing for ourselves, for the people that we love, and how we can take responsibility for our own lives. And that really is the ultimate message of astrology, the way I see it, rather than being about prediction, rather than being about, well, this is going to happen to you. Saturn's going to kick your butt this year, and then it will be Pluto next year, but you've got a little bit of Jupiter in 2024, whatever. It's not really about any of that. It's really about actively engaging in life, understanding who you are, what you were born to be, but also making the most of the times around you. And that's easier said than done. Nowadays I say to students, we're learning astrology, and 88, I think it is, or over 80% of the population are starving or on the breadline, really. And learning astrology is a huge gift and luxury. So, because most of the population don't have the luxury of sitting there and learning astrology and learning what to do with their transits. And if you've got that opportunity to sit back in a privileged position, and we make the most of it, rather than disengage or think of it as a predictive system. So we're very privileged to be able to learn it. Let's make the very most of it if we are learning it and if we are working with it.
I agree, because I do think that the way that my life changed when I started studying astrology, initially I kind of just thought, why on earth didn't I do this sooner? Because it brought so much, as somebody who's quite a controlling person, I suppose I would say, Capricorn, Sun, Scorpio, Moon, and I know I can be a bit controlling sometimes, and if things feel out of control, they can feel chaotic for me. I know that, like I've said, astrology doesn't mean that we have control, but there's a sense of making the most of what is coming, or making the most of what we've got at that time. And I do feel that for me, that's how I feel happiest, is knowing kind of how to make the best out of something. If I can't control what's going on, if I can make the best out of the situation, and even if I don't, like if I can look back on the transits that I've had with the hindsight that I've got, and understand what I was going through and still learn from that retrospectively, because I do feel that astrology is a great tool with hindsight as well as looking forward. I think looking backward is incredibly powerful with astrology. I think that's what it really does for me. And I think that a lot of the people that come to see me for readings, and I know when I've come to see you for readings as well, myself personally, it's just having that little handle on something to just know that there's maybe a bump in the road ahead, where I'll have to start using a different skill set in order to manage some of the things that may arise, but that doesn't, it's ultimately going to be about growth. It's always about growth. I think every single experience that we have is about growing towards our sun, really, isn't it? And it is about that growth process. So maybe it's reframing things slightly and being able to see things in a more positive light, because we know what to expect to an extent. Or maybe it's just a sense of just having that kind of illusion of control for myself personally, but also the ability to let go at the same time, that I found really useful with astrology, and particularly the type of astrology that I learnt at the LSA, because it wasn't fatalistic. It was very, as you've described, humanistic previously. And I do consider myself, I've studied humanistic counselling skills since I left the LSA, and I consider myself a humanistic astrologer who uses lots of different methods. But I don't believe that there's necessarily it doesn't have to condemn you. You don't have to have transits, don't have to be condemning, like as we've touched on. So, I think that it's been for me, it's enriched my life no end, and it continues to do so. And I know that people who are listening to this podcast also feel the same way, whether they're new or experienced astrologers. They all seem to get a very similar kind of feeling from studying the subject.
I think the control, if you're looking for it, and we obviously all need a level of control, the control comes from discovering meaning So I think astrology gives us meaning. We can attach a planet, we can attach a transit to a particular time of our lives and understand the quote unquote lesson that is coming up. But also the control of just being able to respond in, this is where the free will comes in. You know, we know that as soon as you're born, as soon as you have that snapshot of time, that birth chart, you're going to get transits at particular times. You can't avoid them. You know, if you're born with 26 Capricorn on the ascendant, however many years ago, you'll be having Pluto on your ascendant in 2021, 2022. You can't avoid that. There's a fatalism about that. The rest of it, I think, is negotiable. We can't stop what our governments do sometimes. We can't stop what nature does, or whole maybe 101 other things that we don't have too much control or power over. But we can act, we can respond, we can choose to engage, we can choose to believe somebody else's criticism, we can choose to accept somebody else's limits as our own, or we can choose to ignore the criticism and say whatever your opinion is of me, that's really none of my business. That's about you and it's about your life. Or we can make choices to improve our lives and not be hung up on other people's idea of limits. For example, a simple thing of parents saying, oh, I know you're interested in that astrology, but when are you going to get a real job? When are you going to settle down and get a real job? Because most of them say that from anxiety and they want the very best for you. I'm hoping most parents say that sort of thing, but really what they're saying is, I'm fearful that you won't have everything I want for you. And yet, I'd rather have astrology in my life than a 9-to-5 that brought in the money but gave me no passion, no interest. So often we have to convince the people around us that following our own bliss is what we have to do. And it can never be too late to start that, whatever age you are. So I know we're covering a lot of different ideas here, but it's interesting how families who do really generally, most of the time, generally and genuinely want the best for you will often encourage you to stay within certain limits of their own framework, their own mindset. And astrology is incredibly empowering. Instead of it being what most people think it is, as this is who you are, this is what you're going to be. It's in fact, it's a whole lexicon, it's a whole rainbow. What else can we think of? It's a whole spectrum. Of possibility of different things that you could become, different skills you could master. We all look at our charts and think, okay, if we've got strong Libra, we could be a diplomat, we could look at gender relations, we could look at equality, we could simply go into the beauty industry and enjoy the Libra Venus quality of that. Or you might want to go into something, as I say, about fighting for rights or freedoms or against injustices. You might want to head over to some country and campaign for better rights for women, better rights for minorities, etc. So there's always a level that we operate. And as astrologers, we have to gauge that when we talk to a client, because I often sit down with people who want nothing to do with the spiritual life. And I'm not here to sell any spiritual life. I'm not going to recommend anybody meditate or do anything spiritual or go on a retreat unless they bring that in, and we might talk about it. But there are a lot of people who are very, very happy just operating on a particular level. And we as astrologers have to speak to them at that level with what they want in mind. And I'm not talking higher or lower level, just at a particular wavelength that people have. And sometimes it's money and work and quote unquote simple stuff. Sometimes it's more challenging stuff. So we have to be very versatile as astrologers, I feel. Yeah.
And I think that you have a particular gift for communicating your ideas and basically the subject of astrology. And you've written extensively, haven't you? You've written so many books.
Yes, I think so.
It was you, wasn't it?
I've written a lot of articles as well. That's what always amazes me. I think I've written about 90 pieces for the Mountain Astrologer over the years.
Wow.
And they have 6 issues a year, and I've been writing them for about 12 years now. So I think I've written about 90 pieces, sometimes more than one piece per issue, and the Astrological Journal, of course. So I've got a lot of material. The great thing nowadays with online and the classes is that instead of just teaching something I've written about, I'll send the students an article to read, and then we'll spend our time working on their charts or their ideas, because I've already written about it. They might as well read about it in their own time. So I've written about, oh gosh, so many different subjects, and as you say, different books and mini books and all sorts of things. Yes, yeah, lots of writing.
I've recommended on this podcast to get to the heart of your chart, because I've got that book, I've used it. I think we did a weekend session where we used the worksheets at the back to really identify your chart signatures. We did that at the school, didn't we?
We did.
And you've got the Midheaven book, which I've referred to when we've been talking about house systems and that kind of thing. The solar arc directions book. Have you got a new one of that coming out now?
No, about 3 years ago, I wrote a book called The Solar Arc Handbook, which is an extended version of that original booklet. And I wrote the booklet, I don't know, I can't remember when, 2011 maybe. It was a bit of a response to Noel Till's book. And Noel was lovely to me, and we had dinner a few times, and he died just over a year ago. And interesting man, very dramatic, Noel Till. And a lot of people don't know how to pronounce his name. And it would drive him crazy if people called him Noel. And he'd say, it's Noel. And then I've heard people call him Tile. And, so it's funny because he attached quite a lot of importance to that. And he wrote books. He wrote a book on solar art directions. It was about 600 pages. And he and I were always very interested in solar arc. And at the time, maybe 20 years ago when I began researching it, there were not many books on solar arc, just his work. And I started doing a lot myself and working with it. And I almost deliberately wrote this 40-page or 32-page, whatever it was, booklet on how to do it, to say it can be done to the point. And I didn't need to use 3,000 words when I could use maybe 150. And so it was a bit of a response to that. It was a bit of a Uranian response to not wanting to write what could be more like a draft excluder by the time you print it, this huge mammoth book. And, good on him for writing an enormous number of enormous books that had an enormous impact. That's part of his legacy. But I came away thinking, I'm going to put it in a small edition and teach you everything you need. And then, as irony would have it, I thought, there are so many more examples I want to share. But I still did them. The book, the way the book is laid out, the new book, the Solar Arc Handbook, is that there's a chart and a bi-wheel on one side, and then there's probably about 300-400 words on a page, and I absolutely ended on that page. So they're spreads, and it was a determination of mine not to go and to wax lyrical. So I put a few articles in from TMA, Mountain Astrologer, in there, and I love it. It's one of my favorite books. I think my latest book is always my favorite book, and that was the time that I published the book of music horoscopes, with your essay as well in there. So
it was a busy essay.
It was great. I loved your essay. It was great fun, and I loved
the documentary's even better, I have to say. If you've not watched it yet, you must.
I ordered it after reading your essay because it was great fun, and I just thought, what a great mercurial story, really. And I guess it took a Gemini rising to write it.
I just knew when I saw those two, I was like, there's Mercury is happening here, lots of Mercury. And such a great story. I've actually recommended it in a couple of my other episodes with links for people to watch, and that was The Great Hip Hop Hoax. But I did write an article about it in a book that Frank published, so it was my first proper publication, actually. So I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me. And actually, I think we're probably at a good point to stop for the first segment, if you're okay to return for a little chat in part 2.
Shall I change clothes and look like it's a different time?
Let's just do it. Let's just go all out. Let's Liz Hurley, embrace the Liz Hurley and have many costume changes. Maybe don't wear your safety pin dress though, Frank.
I know, it wouldn't fit today, I'm afraid, after a year of lockdown.
Well, we'll return in part 2. I think we might have to touch on maybe some common themes that come up for people in their readings, or the common interests that people go for, and maybe a bit of solar arc conversation as well, because I thought that was starting to get quite juicy, and I thought it might be fun for people to learn a little bit more about it. Okay. If that's okay with you. Okay, well, if anybody listening to this podcast wants to come and learn from you, where can they come and do that?
Well, the easiest way, thank you, is to go to www.londonschoolastrastrology.com, and that has all the online stuff. And we're now in 2021 as we speak. By the end of 2021, the courses are going to be online. Some of them are going to still be in London, but we're going to be doing a mix of pre-recorded and live classes to explore what you watched in the pre-recorded.
Okay, well, let's pause for a drink, and I'll speak to you in part 2.
Okay.